I wanted to practice carbon fiber skinning on a difficult shape, so I got this steering wheel from Amazon and I peeled off the vinyl fabric that was covering the top and bottom grips. It was glued on and stitched on, so I just trimmed off the stitching and then ripped it off of the glue, and it came off pretty cleanly. Then I covered the side grips with tape because I was originally planning on not doing anything with the left and right grips, although later I ended up peeling that off and doing something else. But for now, I just covered off the parts that I wasn't going to be covering in carbon fiber. I sanded the surface of the grips a little bit to rough it up to get better adhesion. On the very edges, I added a bit of vinyl electrical tape because resin will kind of release from that, at least better than the blue tape. And I used the fabric pieces that I had peeled off to create a template for the carbon fiber. I trimmed out the shape just by tearing some forged carbon fiber fabric to approximately the right size. I did 2 layers of fabric for each grip to give it some thickness so I would have room to sand the area smooth after it's cured. I added the resin first by putting the 2 layers together, right sides together, on some plastic, adding resin into the center and over the top. And I rolled that out with a rubber roller to spread the resin and get rid of as much of the air pockets as possible. I also used a heat gun in there to warm up the resin and help it to spread better and help pop some bubbles. I pre-wetted out the surface of the steering wheel with the resin to reduce the chance of any dry spots and make sure that it all adheres nicely, hopefully. Then I moved the carbon fiber into position using that plastic that I had rolled it out on, and then just peeled the plastic away. So the backing on this carbon fiber fabric makes it so that you can handle it a little bit without completely ending up with carbon fiber absolutely everywhere. But it's still pretty messy doing it this way. I'm not sure there is a non-messy way to skin a steering wheel like this. To hold the carbon fiber in place and compress it while it cures, I used a shrink wrap tape and just wrapped that around and around and around and around to cover the whole surface and compress all of the fabric in place. This is a similar way of using the carbon fiber and the shrink tape that I did on the Nautilus shell on a project a long while back. It's a difficult shape right in the center there on this grip, so that didn't get compressed perfectly with this as I was putting it down, but I did the best I could to wrap it from multiple directions so that it would be fairly well pressed into place. And the ends of that shrink tape just get taped down with regular tape to keep it from unspooling while you're trying to heat it up and shrink it down. Once it was wrapped up nicely, then I was able to wipe it up a little bit. And of course I went over it with a heat gun to shrink that tape down. So the clear plastic has a release agent on it already, so it will release well, but also because it shrinks when you get it hot, that's what adds in that extra compression that you might get from a vacuum bag in a less complex shape than this. Then I repeated this process with the 2 layers of carbon fiber for the top grip. Same thing, wet everything out with the resin, use the heat gun to pop bubbles and help the resin flow better, and then just roll out all of the excess so there's not more resin than you need and not any more trapped air bubbles. There's gonna be some in there, but this reduces that as much as possible. Wet down that surface before applying the carbon fiber, wrapping it around and removing the plastic, then using the shrink tape to compress everything together. When you heat up that shrink tape, it compresses everything so some of the resin oozes out, and you can just wipe that off and clean things up. Once it's all packaged like this, it's actually pretty neat. I left that to fully cure and then just peeled off all of that shrink tape. And the surface underneath obviously is not going to be perfect or smooth because it's a little bit irregular when using shrink tape, but I sanded that down until it was the correct shape again, nice and smooth. I cleaned up the edges that were right next to the left and right grips that I was not planning on replacing, and just trimmed off any carbon that was overhanging. Unfortunately, I misjudged the depth in some places and accidentally sanded through the carbon into that base grip there. It's kind of a rubbery material. To fix those spots, I used some of the scraps of the carbon fiber fabric that I had saved from when I was creating the first template pieces. And I prepped those in exactly the same way, just adding some resin, rolling it out between plastic, and then applying those just to the areas that needed to be patched up, and using a bit of shrink tape on those spots. Once that cured, then I just removed the shrink tape, sanded it smooth, and ensured that all of the areas were covered in the carbon fiber now. And then after that, I added a couple more layers, thin layers of the epoxy resin to get a nice smooth, glossy finish on the top and bottom grips. And at this point, I had accidentally gotten resin leaking under the tape onto the left and right grips, so I just decided to go ahead and redo those also, but using leather. So I removed the fabric covering on those side grips and wet molded some leather around the complex shape. This works really, really well. You just wet down the leather, fold it around, and then you have to clip it in place. I used a bunch of tiny little clamps for this and trimmed off all the excess that I needed to get it to sit properly around the shapes. And then I left that to dry so that everything was pre-formed. This makes it way easier to stitch it on nicely. Once the leather was dry, then I trimmed it up a little more neatly, and I pre-stitched the sides to make it easy to sew it together onto the wheel. I had never done this before, so I found some YouTube videos on how to reupholster a steering wheel and just followed those instructions with how to stitch it and everything. I added a little bit of spray adhesive onto this to hold it into those details and also to keep it in place while I was stitching it. This worked really well. So then I did the hand stitching to properly attach it in place around the wheel, and of course flipped down all of the edges so everything's nice, neat, and finished looking. While I was stitching the leather on, I had to wet it again a little bit in a few spots to get it to properly conform to the shape. So then once it was all stitched on, I just wiped off any extra moisture, let it dry, and it was good to go. Even though I didn't intend to replace those side grips originally, it ended up looking much nicer. Black leather and the carbon were a nice complement to each other. And I got a pretty good surface on this. Now it's not clear coated, this is just the epoxy resin that's been polished. I had to sand it to get it smooth and then polish it out with some polishing compound. And that came out pretty well. But certainly if this was going to be installed in a car, you'd want to have something there like a clear coat that's going to provide more UV protection than just the epoxy resin by itself. So my first ever steering wheel, I think it came out pretty well. Here's how the carbon looks when it's under direct light. You get a lot of reflection back versus in the more diffused light. It's a little more subtle. It's a pretty cool look.